back into the day.
How many, did you get any RSVPs?
Yeah, about 15. So I don't know.
Usually that means half of them.
Yeah, but then someone should be, but not a lot more.
Hi. Yeah, Malone down here. At least now we've got a quorum.
Critical mass here.
Yeah, yeah. So
I'm Brook, Lenker.
So let's just do exactly that. Let's say hello. So we have actually people watching us. We have an audience. So we're on the internet. We actually have people watching us. Hello. Hello. This is the Ecologic Institute birthday on Earthday. And but it's not just that. It's a lot more. It's also our energy solutions and discussion of state and national energy policies based actually on facts, not just out in the blue. We have here fabulous guests. I start with you. So I said in the invitation that you know a lot about New York State. The New York State has a rethinking the energy process. We are very, very in all other things of sustainable living and sustainable energy development. And you know a little bit about the fracking debate in New York State as well. And that's important. So the personal thing is so important. So thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
And then, since I said fracking already, we continue. We have two guests from FracTracker. It's not really next door. So you came all the way from Pennsylvania, where FracTracker Alliance has their headquarters. And so we have Brook, Lenker here. Thank you. And Sam Malone. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
And you have wealth of experience, knowledge about fracking and what's happening with fracking. A lot come from Pennsylvania, of course, but meanwhile, you're also active in other states. Mm-hmm. And in particular, there is the project Our Energy Solutions, which is host for the day today. This project is about presenting, not only discussing the impacts of fracking and the dangers of fracking or the risks of fracking, but also talking about alternative energy solutions, talking about renewable energy solutions, and going to the communities, going to Florida, going to North Carolina, going later this year or very soon, May actually go to Argentina and Uruguay, and then later in the year going to a bunch of countries in Europe, including the UK, including Poland, including possibly also Hungary, Germany, the Netherlands. The list is very long. Of course, there are limits to what we can do in a short time frame. In addition, we can't be everywhere we are. I mean, you know this already. We have a Facebook page, we have a website, and we have a Facebook group. This is always important to point out because it's a public Facebook page, but then we have a private dimension on Facebook as well, which is the closed group where people can discuss in unopened, unpublic, invisible way. So that makes it more easy for participants to maybe voice concerns or fears. So that's for introductions for the event today. My name is Ecologic Institute, so also today very proud to celebrate the 7th anniversary of the Institute here in Washington, D.C. And the 7th year is, of course, still very short in historic terms, but we also know there's the same 7th year itch. So it's not, I'm also very proud to have that we made it that far, and then looking forward to many more years. In the room here, we have also with us a few people who made it that early to a little bit of coffee and cake. So I wanted you to get a chance to introduce yourself if you're comfortable in broadcast. If you want to be anonymous, that's also fine. I respect privacy. So, do you want to start?
Yeah,
Karen?
there's one lady.
Oh, hi, Joanne. Yeah, that's right in here. Yeah, that means it's on. It's maybe, yeah, it should, but it's not. We do have audio.
Thanks for the heads up. Now I'm going to
So-
alter what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
So good morning, my name is Carmen. I used to hang out with Michael and Lisa a lot, who used to be here at the Ecologic Institute outside of climate and energy at the German embassy, and I'm currently in transition.
I'm Melinda Kimball. I'm a policy advisor at the United Nations Foundation, and I've been working with Ecologic since 2005 CSD, where we did a lot of work on the energy issues.
My name is Daniel Snrooney. I'm a student at George Washington University. I'm taking a class right now that suggested that I come here. My professor is.
Yeah, do you want
Hi,
to?
good morning. Here's Malone from MSc, working on energy and climate.
So, I assume there'll be more people taking in. We'll just go ahead. Since some of you have to leave on time, and I don't want to take away too much time from this morning. So today is Earth Day. Very important day. I'm thinking that everybody, if you on the Google page, you can't miss it. It says it's Earth Day. What does it actually mean? Why is it an important day? Well, it started as an activist day, and I think it's important to know that maybe it's nowadays, Earth Day in general. There's still a lot to be done, and there's a lot of challenges out there, and not only far away, not only remote challenges. We all know there are challenges that are of global nature, climate change. We have also regional crises such as water scarcity, but we also have very local impacts, such as impacts on drinking water quality or air pollution, which then has direct health impacts for many people in many communities. These are years. These are very concrete impacts on everyday life. So in that sense, I wanted to go to Brook and Sam, and maybe you can tell me a little bit more about what your impressions are, what your take-home lessons are from your work in Pennsylvania. Also, having recently to 2 workshops in Florida on the east and the west coast, and then also in North Carolina, 2 workshops in 2 very different locations, one in Raleigh, one in Nashville. What you can bring home to this group here in Washington, D.C., and the people watching us online, what the impression was, what the level of concern is, but also the level of information, what we need to providing additional information, where the gaps are. Because sometimes we sit, I mean, I say we, this is very generalizing, but one might sit and watching and imagine the world being such and such, and imagining such and such information being required, but maybe in reality, it's a bit different. So these are a lot of questions, so feel free to advise a little bit on that too.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, if I could to try to reflect on those many questions, I suppose we've been seeing extraction in Pennsylvania since about 2005 or so, and so there have been well documented impacts on communities and on people, on the environment from some of those Max even mentioned. So air emissions, water problems, a lot of water use, a lot of waste issues, certainly especially on dealing with the drilling that occurs on state forest lands, a lot of habitat fragmentation. So there's this plethora of issues, and I think Pennsylvania has been an interesting sort of experiment in some regard for this, relatively new type of drilling. Just as one example, we've seen over 250 cases of problems with people's drinking water wells, where the State Department of Environmental Protection has said, yes, we're assigning blame to the energy industry through what they call a determination letter. And beyond those 250 cases, there have been probably 1,000 other complaints, some of which are still being investigated. So it's really, I think, then reflecting on some of our recent experiences in Florida and North Carolina, I kind of sum it up two ways. I think there's a lot of concern, especially because in those two states, fracking in the sort of broadest sense of the word is really just getting started or may get started. And Florida is, both are just at the cusp of potentially more of that energy development. So there's a lot of concern, but I'd say too, there's a lot of hope. And you can really see that in the faces of the people that came out to our workshop and this and both of those states, whereas they're looking at this potential, the potential for drilling to begin sort of wholesale, there are also two states with a lot of potential. Florida has been largely untapped for solar. I think less than 0.5% of their solar capacities being currently generated, and North Carolina is much further along. I think 4th in the country in terms of solar output, solar energy output, but there's a lot more there. And so it's these are interesting paradigms. I think it was fitting that we had some of our workshops at universities. I think looking at how we continue to perpetuate a renewable energy future largely, but not solely, depends on engaging young people. And it was really heartening to see these we got from students, coming up to us afterwards and shaking our hands very sincerely, really appreciative of the information and the messaging we shared. So I think, and you see that in terms of divestment campaigns from fossil fuels. I participated in the climate march in Washington last fall, and there were thousands of young people involved from campuses all over the country.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of interest by young people, and I think we want to continue to along this renewable energy spectrum. We need to get more and more young people involved.
Thank you, Brook. Sam, I hope you still have something to add to that. I thought it was quite broad as a response. I thought it was very interesting. I can only agree that having the young people join or being part of the debate was very important. But I was also impressed by other age groups joining as well. So that was also impressive that entire families came with their kids. So several generations sitting there sitting down with others and everything. That was also impressive. And they came from far away, showing us how relevant the problem or the challenge is. So Sam,
how different every region is. Every state has different regulatory processes. They also have a different environment. How much you can accept fossil fuel and extract industry. Pennsylvania is probably more on the supportive end of extractive industry, but there's still a lot of concern despite that. So it was interesting to kind of look at how Florida and how North Carolina kind of with fossil fuels and extraction. And I think that was very representative in Asheville. We had some different kinds of groups that came, and in Raleigh, I don't get the floor good or anything, yeah. But it was still a really, I think, eye-opening thing to see, because sometimes I feel like I'm in the Pittsburgh area and it feels like everybody's just like, oh, well, here we're just gonna have to deal with fracking and you see how best we can do it. And some areas are still more, I think, on the New York side, where it's like, well, we're not really sure we want to bring this on, and they're looking at it a little bit differently.
That's actually an opening question also, and we've seen different states now. You presented the history in different states, and also explaining that the tolerance or openness or the concern is very different from state to state, and probably also within states from region to region. And certainly one factor that comes into it is whether they have a history of fossil energy extraction. Still, the question is, can we basically leave it to the states? Is this something that, we say, okay, it's an issue? It's something that is best dealt with state by state because that's closer to the constituents, and that's something that obviously works out in some cases very well, in some cases less, and has then results in different levels. You mentioned the solar potential in Florida is huge. The tapped potential is still very, very small. Actually, many states have far lower solar potential, but that's then just how it is because of it being left to the states. Or is it more something that we need more federal or overarching push? What do you think? And I pass it over to Suzanne because you haven't been able to say. You can also say something from your New York State perspective, coming in basically from the north onto the discussion.
Sure. Thanks for Earthday, everybody. It's interesting. I've been in DC for the last 12 years, and I'm about to move back to my home state of New York, in large part because of all of the exciting progress there. And it's interesting to reflect back when I was getting my environmental science degree in Pennsylvania years ago. We learned that Earthday was started in large part because some of the environmental policy was so extreme that it woke people up. Rivers caught fire and these things. So it's interesting now, almost half a century later, all of a sudden we have these new and enhanced threats to Republican administrations, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and a lot of these things, these basic protections for our public health have been basically pulsed into fracking. And so the question about should we have federal oversight and a federal energy policy, well, it's an absolute no-brainer for anyone who wants us to have a comprehensive strategy for the energy that our entire economy and society depends on. But because for so many different reasons, and in large part because of the incredible financial strength and the strength of the economy, it's just the logical things don't happen. With that said, what is happening at the state level is what's exciting. So students nowadays are studying all the progress being made at the local level, the city level, the county, state level. That's where our foreign colleagues from overseas come, and the German embassy just supported an exchange between New York State energy professionals and Germany, and that work is going on. Because that's where the innovation and all the exciting things are happening. So, I can talk more about it if you want, about New York and fracking. But I think, for folks that don't know, New York has banned fracking. And I think it's just a spectacular example of what happens when people, all kinds of people come together and say, this is not what we want. it's just a really incredible example of empowerment. People actually, the government actually did what people asked them to. The vast majority of the people wanted, and now we're on to pave the way for the energy revolution. So it's very exciting.
So yes, I mean, we've seen, actually, we've heard from your colleague, Karen Edelstein, about the movement in New York State on fracking. But there are, of course, other impacts that still can occur, for example, the wastewater disposal, right?
Yeah.
That's still an issue in New York State. And the gas storage is also still on the table. So, I mean, I'm not trying to
We're still
diminish
working.
the
We're still
victory.
working.
And we should definitely be positive about any progress being made that impacts the environment and water resources. That's definitely beneficial. I just wanted to say there's more work to be done, probably. You're also pointing to the enormous potential for an energy revolution or evolution in New York State.
Yeah, revolution's
So do you want to say anything about that? Because that might be not so well known to everybody in the room.
Sure. Yeah, and this really are the next 10 years are going to be just the most exciting time for the energy sector. We're going to see more change in the power grid and our electricity system in the next 10 years than we've seen in the last 100. Right now, it's the exciting time for people to engage in this with all the new smart grid technologies, storage technologies, the rapidly declining costs of solar and wind and other renewables. And so in New York State, interesting that you point out that we have a lot more work to do, which we do. And one of my colleagues was just telling a whole lot of folks last week that, you know, yes, definitely celebrate the victory with the ban, but take a small break because there are they want to put more gas pipelines through the state. They want to put a gas storage depot in for the whole Northeast in Watkins Glen and a natural geological salt caverns. And it turns out that only 7% of natural gas of these different types of gas storage happens in salt caverns, and 100% of that so one of the local statisticians calculated 40% chance that this thing will explode in a place where the lake supplies water for 100,000 people. Anyway, so yes, so there's still a lot of work going on. There are a lot of people who say we don't want a few years or a few decades worth of potential economic gain for a few people from these fossil fuel investments that put at risk all the other industries, local agriculture, wine and tourism for generations. So I think you want me to talk about the REV process probably and some of these other things. New York State last April, so you're going to start a process to reform the electricity sector. So right now, if you're an electricity utility, you see distributed renewable energy as a threat to your business. And so what New York is saying is rather than set up utilities to fail or turn them up or allow them to stand in the way of our clean energy future, they're going to change the way that the utilities make their money. So utilities in the future will make money based on the quality of energy services they provide rather than how many electrons they pump out. And how you do that is a big question, and that's what New York is working through. And they're doing a lot of public consultation and doing a lot of public processes to try and get input and do that in the best way possible.
It's a very good thing that you bring that up. The role of the utilities in the process and overcoming the resistance there, because very often we've heard that when we came to different places. You've seen that in Florida, but also in North Carolina, and probably also, I don't know, Pennsylvania, a situation where usually the default situation being that utilities oppose having an increase in distributed energy or intermittent energy cases I've also referred to them where people try to point out the unreliability of it. And it's also, we can see a lot of the discussion is also it's already a first step in setting up where you draw the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not. So it's very interesting to see how this is actually something that they try to overcome in New York State. Of course, we're still in the process, so we don't know yet how successful this will be. And it's also a process, it's a one-off exercise. There are different phases in the process, and there'll be probably revisions to it. But the attempt is there, the willingness is there. There's about consensus towards, and that's also something where maybe other states can learn from that, even though the conditions are very different from state to state. So here's where we're coming again to the question: is it a state-by-state issue? Or should there be at some point somebody saying this is the national framework for doing such energy transitions, and we're all moving that.
I just make a good point, so I'll throw it back to these guys. I mean, it's a state-by-state issue because there's leadership in the states, and we're lacking that same inspiration and leadership at the national level. It's not because it's the best thing, it's because that's just the way that leadership exists or doesn't exist right now. So, yeah.
Brook. So, yeah.
You know, it's important that some of these states continue to serve as sort of incubators of sort of best approaches to renewables, but clearly we need federal leadership on these issues. I mean, the country's done amazingly well with new, renewable energy capacity, taking off successes. But I can only imagine how much we could accelerate that progress if we had really strong leadership. And I don't know what the perfect recipe for more, it needs to be a little bit of everything. It needs to be certainly the proper regulation, the clean power plan probably addresses some of that. We need bold incentives. We have some, but probably more. But I think even more than that, it's really about leadership and sort of goal setting. It's been said we need a Marshall Plan for renewables, and I think that's true. The only way we're gonna, the energy and climate challenge is monumental, right? So the only way you can, I think, truly address it in the way it needs to be addressed is strong, state programs. Certainly, the private sector has a role. Individuals have a huge role, but we need a voice. We need we need champions at the federal government level, and there are some, but it's not the voice. The voice is out.
Yeah.
I would say to give a good example on a more less abstract basis is that we look at data all the time at FracTracker, and violations of oil and gas companies, what their trends are, and unfortunately, because it's state by state regulated, the data sets are either non-existent or based on violations information on oil and gas industries, and that's problematic when you look at how can you compare companies state to state and look at the bad actors and the ones that are doing it more responsibly. I think that can highlight the federal oversight on these issues, because if you have companies that are out there, polluting either intentionally or unintentionally, you have some real issues with any kind of talk on sustainability from that perspective.
Right. Regulation on fracking on federal lands, but of course that's only affecting very specific activities. And then, if I remember correctly, only 4 states published the violations publicly, right? In the entire United States, apart from that. So that's a small fraction. So that's really something that there should be more, because obviously everybody has a right to know. I mean, information access is very crucial for making then informed decisions.
It's interesting you bring up a federal lens too. I think one of the things that I actually don't know that I would say that we need a Marshall Plan, because I think that probably it sets off huge red flags in fiscal conservative minds, and it sounds like a huge government spender. And so what I would say is that that there are so many massive subsidies for fossil fuels, hidden and overt, that we start right there, reduce and phase out those subsidies, and those in the changes that are needed to facilitate a modern, clean, safe energy system. And that's it. I mean, especially since tax day was just 2 weeks ago here. And I think there are a lot of we have a lot of colleagues that would say just remove all of the subsidies, simplify this, and let these technologies compete. I mean, one of the interesting things about fracking, all of the extreme extraction techniques. I mean, fracking stands for fracturing. They're literally setting off explosions, and they're fracturing the bedrock that we live on, using it with extreme extraction techniques that it boggles the mind when you really look at it. And so and it's happening, and the scale up of these extreme techniques, it's happening the lower risk clean solutions are hitting price parity with the dirty stuff, even with the subsidies in a lot of markets around the world. So it's really an epic moment where we have to decide as a society which future we want, and really understand the questions.
Good. Well, that's a good idea. But just from my experience, it's always a lot easier to add subsidies than to take them away. It's a politically very difficult. But I fully agree with you. I'm not saying that that's not the right way.
We should have started the campaign the day after tax day to remove the subsidy for the fossil fuel.
So next session we have to push for that very aggressively. So I want to open the floor or the table to anybody in the room asking questions. And you want to say who you are?
I'm Linda Campbell from the UN Foundation, but I feel like I've been dropped in a Back to the Future conversation. I don't want to sound like Marco Rubio, but I used to sit in these rooms in the Clinton administration on electricity dereg. An electricity dereg at the federal level established, opened the door in many ways to later state regulation for renewable energy. But it did another thing. We couldn't find a way to solve the transmission problem. So now we have a global transmission system in the States that's actually still intact and still subject to great vulnerability. And yet we haven't found a way for it to make money. So solar vendors are making money. And another group that makes a lot of money are people who build gas-fired generators. And so fracking actually helps these guys. And what California and the Northwest states are actually trying to go at the utilities in a much more constructive way. But utilities have their own regulatory regimes, and it takes a lot of time. So, and because of the way our system evolved, we don't have a good way to formulate federal level policy unless you get a broad consensus. And I just note that Portman and Jean Shaheen, after 3 years and much trimming, finally got an energy efficiency. out of the Congress that actually may be signed. I mean, shock, we may have legislation. I mean, in the Clinton administration, we all these things at the table, but there were many problems that the lift was too heavy. And when the Bush administration followed, things stopped. It's amazing how quickly power can change and change the environment for progress. And all I have to do is send to Mitch McConnell, who probably go crazy if you talk about federal fracking regs beyond federal land.
Right. Well, thank you, Melinda. So this is putting it back in the historical context, how things started and then kind of got stuck in a way, but that doesn't mean they're stuck forever. So,
No, actually, my was that start seeded what can happen now with solar and wind. It was certainly because of the tax benefits to people investing in solar and wind, which were mirrored in the States. You suddenly got a lot of people making independent decisions on distributed generation. But then you look at a state like Hawaii, you think Florida has potential, and Hawaii's public utility is resisting putting in solar.
Yeah.
And they have their energy.
Yeah. No, that's true. Of course. I mean, none of us are real experts for the situation in Hawaii, I think, but
I could work on that.
You can brain for that.
I think it needs to be a team effort.
Yes, definitely. But I think what you said is really important. That the federal obligation to set the framework and things can happen from there on. But that's sometimes not really seen so much because people don't necessarily trace the chain of cause and impact back to that. And sometimes the federal setting the stage is a bit off because then it's not taken into account. What will this actually lead to? And when we said the regulation on drilling on federal lands is also something similar because that could lead to being a blueprint for state regulation. And so it's at least the hope, I think, that this will be tried also. It's an easy to apply blueprint. What do you think? Is this realistic?
Well, and some would say that the federal rules for drilling on lands are yeah. I mean, this is sort of a different point, I guess I'd like to make. It's important looking at this whole universe. Going back a few years, especially coming out of the Pennsylvania experience, it was all about show, and that was sort of a mantra. And I think one of the things I've learned from working with FracTracker and looking at these issues is that that's sort of a lie. I mean, not that natural gas doesn't burn cleaner, and if fracking regulations were perfect and the technology was flawless, that could maybe help in the transition. But I think what we've seen is that this isn't a shale gas revolution. This is a hydrocarbon revolution. So it might be natural gas, dry gas in part of the Marcellus, but then it's wetter gas as you move west. And then you go to other formations, whether they're in Texas or Bakken, and then of course at the same time there's still a lot of interest in expanded drilling in the Arctic, and so it's really not about there's a benign sort of purpose here to just transition us. There are forces at play that, and we know this, it's to get every hydrocarbon out of the ground. What we need, I suppose. So, in the long term. So, I think somehow, I don't have the answer here, but I think somehow we need to, sort of elevate that reality. That are good intentions, and there are real progress being made on renewables, and to some extent, even in the efficiency realm, there's these forces at play. And so I just bring that up. I don't know how that all intersects in this discussion, except to point that out, because I think we, especially the public, you see advertisements on television about clean renewable, clean natural gas, and that's not what's really happening.
But I think, sorry, just very briefly, I want to say that I'm grateful that you say that, because of course it's difficult to say that out loud, but it's something else we talk about. You say natural gas as a bridge fuel, fracking gas as a bridge fuel for going to the low carbon future. Of course, that's really important to consider this, because that's what the whole thing is based on. Why a lot of us support fracking under certain conditions, under the condition that it's looked into being done as safely and as rigorously as possible, because of the assumption that it's better burning coal and that it is a switch towards more renewables. Now you say that what is kind of in the back of a lot of people following news, following also how transition is actually in the reality of energy. We see switch from coal to gas, but we don't see yet the real breakthrough in shares of renewables. That's really, I didn't want to, so please jump in, Suzanne.
I think Brook was quite blunt about the live part, but then he was very diplomatic about there are other forces going on. I think I would be a little bit more on that and say, we are in an epic battle right now between the last 100 years of fossil fuel industry being king and dominating the United States economy and the global economy, and renewable energy future. This is an epic battle, and we can parse out all of the elements. But right now, I think the folk, for those of us who are concerned about future generations, about the planet, massive done by changing climate as a result of burning fossil fuels. We have to look at this epic battle and figure out what and understand our strengths and really play to our strengths, because the fossil industry has a lot of money, has a lot of power as a result of their money, but we have a much better story to tell. We have much better solutions in terms of quality of life, in terms of security, distributed, lower risk. And investment communities realizing this. There's like very few things that you can invest in that have a low, is low risk and a high guarantee of return as a solar, is in solar or wind. So this is an epic battle going on. I mean, make no bones about it. And the Koch brothers just announced publicly that they're going to put $900 million in the 2016 election. It's not being discreet. They announced to the world that they're going to try and buy the elections in 2016 with our money we made in fossil fuels. So this is what's happening. And so yeah, it would be wonderful to have our policy, but if United States citizens actually mobilize and become a real environmental movement, or don't call it environmental, a movement for the future, a unified people's movement, the politicians won't have to go against their
I just have to say, and I'm sorry I have to run off because it's a great discussion. It's important to understand in the most optimistic scenario of the audience, and they are more conservative than the IPCC, REN. Fossil fuels in 2050 are still 70% of total primary energy supply. And that's moving very slowly toward trying to get them out of the system. So even if you want them to be 50% in 2050, a lot of policy shift and investment shift has to occur. And fossil fuels are still getting investment. Unfortunately, you're getting investment in places where you're going to have higher energy demand and more energy growth than in developed countries.
Yeah.
I've been working on solar in Africa, and
It's a great
I
story.
was yes and no, but I was in Kenya. The wind turbines are sitting in warehouses, and diesel generators are still working.
Yeah, that's the irony of
Yeah.
it. We see that also in many southern Caribbean states and diesel generators. They could have.
Put them
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah. Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you.
But but there were other questions around the table too. Yeah.
Well, hi, Alex Garcia. At the very last bit, there was talk of investment, but what's the role of the private sector in this? At least the way I see it personally is that no matter what happens, the positive level of private stuff and big businesses get behind new solutions, and I think we're seeing increasingly that they are, because they want to appeal to their consumer, to their clients, to their customers, to messaging. Things are going to, are sort of moving forward despite what's happening at a regulatory level.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We've seen that in North Carolina, where there are bills in the legislature coming from the Republican side pushing for solar-friendly policies, because they have crops in the district linked to the solar industry. So I think if we look at the economic impacts, the job impacts, and then also the community building impacts, that's really important, because we're not, I think, talking about climate change is definitely, it's important to bring that up too. But I think what you said, bringing in the private sector, getting private sector support.
And it can move a lot faster than any kind of regulation regime.
Absolutely.
I mean, if Walmart decides to put solar panels on top of all of their roofs, like IKEA, they can make that decision in a day if they want to.
And we see how much also impact can result just from single investors. If we look at Tesla in the automotive sector, and then you look at the roads, they're tiny, a niche manufacturer.
But they've made it cool.
And their market capitalization is really tremendous. So that's really showing, at least that's a light on the horizon. It's not yet full there. It shows you how much private sector can contribute. And nobody would talk as much about electric vehicles if that wasn't the Tesla brand on the market.
Yeah, we are following the development over here in the United States, and of course our main question is what could be the next important step for the transition. Actually, what I gathered from a very conservative conference last week is that this business is actually only looking at the prices and what they're doing on the market. Actually, for gas, it looks like we will have gas for the important mark. So below $4, gas is dominating, and that looks like we will have resources forever over here. And so from that side, from the only so the question, of course, remains, and very interesting remarks from Suzanne. So development and New York State just looks at their own benefits. What is new in the camp for renewable business has a lot to offer. But for now, I think the big business, the big fossil business, is not really noting that.
Directly back to you, Suzanne.
Well, this is where it's one of those things where we really need the public to engage, because I completely agree with the comments that, you know, the private sector is leading this, and you know, we have a whole generation of millionaires that made their money in renewables, and you know, battery energy storage is the next, you know, killer app, and absolutely, you know, but I found that thinking with the understanding that the energy markets are highly impacted, and the economics of them are highly impacted by policy. In Europe, when you go to the gas station, half the price you pay is a tax. It's a fraction of that in the US. So they, you know, there's a lot of, you know, the competitiveness of other technologies coming into the marketplace is so heavily driven. Even just using the personal example again, we're working on a large solar array in my family's farm. We have a farm and winery in upstate New York. And you know, I've been working on renewables and environmental issues my entire career, and it is so complicated. We are limited in the system by the type of meter we have. There's just one thing after another, after another, after another. The complexity of making it work, it's amazing. And then this is a mature technology that's been deployed for decades. The local banks that know the agriculture industry and know the wine industry have never financed solar. So there's a learning curve for the banks. And it's just, you know, there's so much to be done on the government side to allow this historic transition from fossil to renewables.
So I want to say maybe two things. One, to kind of reflect back on the price of gas. In actual companies defaulting on the loans that they took out. So that's going to definitely affect the viability of some of the companies on just operating in the US. So that's something to look into in terms of how that affects the line, the amount of the companies are paying out the price of gas. But I also want to say, you know, in addition to the international market, the private sector, we also have communities affecting the community. So some of the conundrum I would say is that you have individuals making money from the companies, the workers, and those that own mineral rights. And that, from a public perspective, better money, definitely improve health. So you're seeing sort of a pushback also on the individual level, because there are people who want to, you know, build up their family farm if they have mineral rights, but then you also have those negative public health impacts, the localized pollution, the boom and bust scenario when it comes to how it changes the dynamics of that community. And then you're looking at, you know, business making money, but more of the workers are transient, at least at the beginning. So I think the public perception is also something to consider when you're looking at renewables, because there is a lot to gain in some situations from the good sale they're not.
Right. And that's actually something guest of the workshops brought up. He said, my enemies aren't the extracting companies, my enemies are my neighbors. Because they might sell their drilling rights, and then he has a rig right in front of his house or farm. So that's really interesting. So we're also talking a lot about communities acting together, working together, not being dispersed as individuals, but having the bigger picture in mind. And that's, I think, very important. That connects also back then to how does municipality A work municipality B, because one might think that's a great opportunity, and whereas the other one doesn't want to follow that path. So it's a lot about collaboration and acting together and finding that together. Actually, it's very important. I think that's also what you try to provide with your FracTracker website, providing information. Because that's also very often where people don't have access. If you live remotely in the countryside, you don't have access to a broad range of information about fracking and where it happens, what's happening in the communities where it's been done. So it's very important.
Brooks, maybe, certainly part of what we do at FracTracker is try to provide decision making and create an informed electorate, I suppose. And I think we the other organizations are making it. But I wanted to come back to to lose my thought here. Around this kind of hope thing, I think it's demonstrated in so many ways, and somebody had said that this isn't a crisis of technology. I think that's very, very true. I mean, not that we have every nuance of the energy challenges figured out, but we have no general path forward. And but that's why this sort of grassroots these grassroots efforts that really are, I think, hopeful. So the New York example, where in like 2011 there were just a few municipal bans, and other citizens in these other communities said, wait a minute, if this town has said, we can take a stand, we can too. At least by one, you went from a handful of communities to well over 100. And in fact, when the New York ban on hydraulic fracturing was announced, people cited these municipal bans. So there's the various examples of where people are saying, enough. We're going to set course for the future. And that's the example for New York. I think another interesting example is where municipalities around the country, especially on the West Coast, but even in my home territory, just too. And those are municipal resolutions concerning oil trains in their communities. And they can't necessarily stop them. They can say, we are hereby asking the federal government, the state government to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And that is truly a movement. I mean, there are these day by day. So we can. I think there's a lot of collective energy building. And I mentioned earlier the divestment. So I think that individual efforts, community efforts, can make a big difference. We were talking about the question of how can private sector. I just want to come back to somebody's point earlier about Hawaii, and I just saw where Hawaii, where another company and real innovator and opportunist came in and said, if this company isn't going to is going to stand in the way of solar progress, we're going to come in and build a smart grid. And there was just coverage of this story the other day. So I don't know what's happening with that. It sounds like there's some real new opportunities for Hawaii, because if this other company starts building the grid for that. Yeah. So anyway, I think there's a lot happening. Not a perfect scenario of the perfect regulations, the perfect federal goals for some of these things, that we're making it happen despite that. But I think good things are happening.
Yeah, thank you. You also brought up the another issue we haven't really touched upon yet today here, the oil trains, which is of course also a huge concern. Because again, another thing, you can ban fracking, but you can ban all the things associated with the fracking, and part of it is, of course, also runs through your community, and you can pass a resolution, which is great because it has signaling power and tells also people up and down the hierarchy that don't want them, but you can't outright ban them, of course. And you've had numbers in your research, how many millions of people are actually in reach of trains on a regular basis, including also all trains passing very close to kindergartens and schools, etc. So where we are really seeing a lot of imminent danger to people's lives. We've seen tragedy in Canada where really it hit the wrong place at the wrong time. So this, we have been very lucky so far, but it also tells us that this is something that requires action.
Yeah. I mean, so what is the solution? Is it that we require better trains and better holding? Because I know that ones that are all over the place in the 1960s and haven't been updated. Or do we say no trains? So what's the alternative then? Is it underground pipelines? I mean, I'd frankly rather see a train that if there's a spill, it can be cleaned up in 2 minutes than an underground pipeline that into the water table and leak for days or weeks or months before anyone realizes there's something going on. I mean, you know, when it gets into our water system. So what is, I mean, I don't really know on the train thing, but it is the solution. You can't just say, don't come through here because that's
Well, and
really.
those advanced tankers have shown to be problematic, even the newer ones. So those aren't necessarily, the best answer. Some of the Germans and Ecologists have included those newer designs. But I would say, some of the things that they're looking at now is mixing in that volatile crude, the crude that is more likely to explode. So that's one thing that is being done, and I think they even looked at some of the recent derailments. If they had done, limited the vapor limit, it would have been a very different scenario. Would have been allowed to be transmitted until it was mixed with other crude. So I mean, that's one example. But you're right, there are really no perfect ways to transport this.
Bakken crude has a higher vapor pressure than gasoline, so it's very volatile. The 1272 cars, the upgraded cars, the new cars, aren't a panacea either. So, but they're looking at certainly more of those cars versus the old models. Slower speeds. And other use. But I think it's sort of interesting. So yeah, there are, as soon as we were involved in some press conferences and the release of a report on the oil train traffic and the populations at risk in Pennsylvania, so pipelines, that's the answer. And yeah, we've looked at pipeline data, and pipelines, there are a lot of accidents on pipelines.
Mm-hmm. And most of them go unreported.
Yeah,
you can't have a train around it.
There was one that leaked about 3,000 gallons on its way from North Dakota over to Washington, and they didn't even realize that it had spilled.
But nationally, looked at federal and there were 1.6 accidents per day on pipelines over that 3-year period.
That were reported.
Yeah. So yeah, there's no perfect solution, and I do going back 15 years or 20 years, yeah, we had hotspots of oil production in this country, like Texas, California. But I think, and we have certainly had a legacy of some shallow drilling with a lighter footprint in other places, but most of us didn't, see these impacts or think about it. We were removed from it physically, and with the shale gas and oil revolution, we've seen not only the expansion of drilling to 30 states in the country, but now we're at this sort of second wave, which is the infrastructure wave. So we have all this oil and gas development. Now, how do we get these products to market? And so we see this expansion in traffic, and now we're seeing this wave of pipeline construction. And these are very controversial proposals because they're big pipelines, some of them, unfortunately, 60-inch pipelines. With the larger size comes a larger risk zone. But your property rights issues, habitat fragmentation, challenges associated with pipelines. So once again, I mean, yes, we have to look sort of pragmatically at how do we minimize risk within those specific types of those transitions. But once again, it comes back to, can we just do this all better to begin with, and we wouldn't have as many risks in our communities? I mean, that's to me what it all comes back to.
I mean, the thing was, I think it's great if oil and gas get closer to home, because actually that's brings people to actually see where the gas comes from, for heat. The gas comes from. In that sense, I coin this as energy responsibility. Yeah, because it's like electricity doesn't come from the outlet. Yeah, something is behind, so get it close to it. And that brings also opportunity, because people see, aha, there are risks. There is actually a lot of spilling and accidents related to that. I don't want that. So that opens opportunity also for switching fuels towards renewables. And I think that's, of course, not a short-term fix to the actual imminent danger of oil trains. That's where we need technological fixes, safer rail cars, reduce speeds, but also better communication with first responders, etc., so that people on the side can actually then deal with the matters. But beyond that, long term, but medium term, I hope it's not long term, medium term, and having reduced dependency on oil and gas, because even if it's not foreign oil and gas, so far let's get out of the dependency on oil and gas imports, and then the solution was to produce it domestically. But obviously, you solve maybe the geopolitical problems, you don't solve the environmental impact problems associated with it at all. You just bring them closer to home.
One of the issues we haven't talked about yet is the leakage of gas is a huge issue that's just finally starting to be talked about. So, as opposed to having liquids going through our infrastructure, our pipelines, we have gases. Gases want to leak. And they are leaking all over the place, not only from the points of extraction, but from all throughout the infrastructure system. Meetings over the fracking fields, and methane is far more powerful than CO2 is a greenhouse gas emission. And all of these rosy numbers that now the United States emissions are down because of our natural gas use, I think are, we don't know what the right numbers are, but we know that they're wrong. Yeah. And all we know is that they're higher than what's being reported, and there is yet to be a really national level about like what those numbers really are, because everyone wants to just say, oh look, natural gas
really nice on paper.
It looks really nice on paper. It, however, is not true.
Yeah.
And so that's something that needs a huge amount of attention. I think we talked about is back to your point about the expansion and the discussion about the expansion of gas pipelines, the expansion of this infrastructure, and a lot of in some of the points about the expansion of gas. Right now, it's being seen as an opportunity, or a bridge. Part of that lie is that 4-year investment. That's a long bridge to a future where we've already hit a bunch of the climate tipping points, and we've been stuck paying for fossil fuels for 40 years. So that's something that really needs to be. You don't put a pipeline in and then take it out 10 years later. Yeah. That's there. You don't put a fossil fuel generation station in and close it down in 10 years. That's 40 years. You're stuck with it, locked into it. And where that the that's a 40-year investment when you don't know what the cost of your input's going to be. Whereas when you put in a wind farm, you put in a solar farm, you know what your cost of operation is going to be. It's going to be zero for your investment. And you know, when we look at right now, looking at the solar on our farm and other farms and wineries in the area, you break down the costs. You know, there's a cost of capital, there's the cost of the equipment, and then there's labor. So being mentioned and jobs are the big thing. We've touched on it. There's a lot more. You don't have any input costs once your asset is up and running. Unlike fossil fuels, where you're always paying for the gas, you're always paying for the oil, you're always paying for the coal. There's no input cost once your asset's up. And, labor is a much bigger part of it, and then maintenance is a part of it. Yeah. Sales, marketing, upkeep, engineering. There's a huge amount of labor throughout the whole value system.
And a lot of local.
And a lot of it's local can be exported. And so that is something that I feel like folks that work in the industry know and talk about, but it's not being talked about in the broader conversation.
Because it's not limited to building the solar panel or the wind. That's where then
Conversation is.
Oh, but it's coming from China, so it's more benefit. But actually, the majority of the workforce impacts are with the maintenance and the infrastructure. That's really important. Thank you. This was actually very already going into the closing round. So I wanted to say we're getting towards the end of our breakfast here. So I wanted to allow you to give us a closing statement. When I start with Sam, it can be short. It's just an outlook into what's happening.
Well, I would say, you know, we focus on fracking. Sometimes that gets really depressing. So it's nice sometimes to have conversations looking at the bigger the energy picture, some of the potentials and hope. You know, we have to be part of this, but I mean, sometimes it's just nice to get out of that silo of fracking and look at some of the other ways that we could progress as a nation and you know, as a world.
Absolutely. And you know, I'm very pleased to be here today. Thank you, Max, for putting this together. I appreciate it. I think, you know, with this Our Energy Solutions project that we go to Argentina next, and as Max mentioned, there'll be some of us will be going to Europe in the fall, and I'm really anxious to hear, to be part of some statistics and to hear about how the discussions go in those places, and to witness sort of the concerns of the populations there, and see what kind of response there are to some of the issues presented today. Because I do think at the core, you know, what we're talking about obviously is these are the global issues, but we're really these issues actually provide the opportunity to really break down barriers and to coalesce as a global community to protect our collective future. And there's so much of it. Certainly climate change itself. So whereas the challenges are really daunting, I think it can we kind of come back to what you said, it's an exciting time. And you know, we feel like feel like we make an impact every day, or we provide a new insight. But to have that sort of FaceTime and be part of this whole community on these issues is personally going to be, I think, very satisfying. But it's also, I think it's just going to keep building, and it's going to be, I don't know, I'm very I'm hopeful about this. I think, and I think it's going to have, if we can collaborate and forge a positive future together, it's going to have repercussions we probably can't even completely imagine. So I'm excited.
Thank you. But I also like that both of you also pointed to the positive outlook. It's a risk when you focus on a challenge such as fracking impacts, to then go only on the negative side. But I think it's very important for all of us to keep the spirits high and elevated, and to be positive and forward-looking, and that, yeah.
Well, it's funny that we have some of our German colleagues in the room, and
Yeah, right.
Germany's the fourth largest economy in the world, and they're a third of their electricity from sun and wind. So you can look at Portugal's at 8%, New Zealand's at 8% renewables. So it's just a matter of, there are multiple future scenarios, and so some of them are very dark with a lot of destruction, a lot of suffering, and some of them are much brighter. So it's this touch point where investments really lock us into different futures, and so we have to decide and really mobilize. And so I have very dark visions of the future that I think are possible, and very, very, very beautiful. And it's a matter of how much we mobilize, both inside the government and outside, to really choose, work as hard as we can to get to the future that we want. And we have a lot of problems in deploying, and it's a really good point. This is not going to be easy. I was on a call yesterday, and this guy kept talking about the problems, and I'm like, we're not going to transform our system. No one thinks it's going to be easy, but it's one of the most important things you can dedicate your time and effort to. So that's why I have. I'm sure that's why you have, and why I love this work. So thank you for all the work you guys are doing on this. I think it's one of the most important things that we can do in our lifetime. So I am also hopeful, and I think there's a huge amount of progress, and it's going to be exciting few years.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think what you brought up in a way also is that we need to connect more. And I think that's also that I took from being in Florida. We worked always with local partners, and being in North Carolina, working with local partners. And there are lots of groups very active, but they usually not connected. And that's something where I think a lot can be done. And I think our getting together here today is a good sign, because together we can fill the gaps. I have some knowledge in some areas, knowledge gaps in others. And so together we can then combine this into providing a more solid bundle. And also something that it's called it. I think I would maybe not try to frame it as a battle, but certainly it's something relevant, and it's certainly something where we all together. It's not, and I wouldn't just talk it down to being a project, because it's more than a project. It's maybe what you would call like it's a task or something like that. And only together can this be achieved. So that's why I think it's really important that people come together, be it online or in person, and join and exchange. I think that's something we need to keep working on, because individually, isolated, it's very difficult. And there's no chance we can win the
The status quo will always fight to preserve itself. So
right.
There's always got to be the people that catalyze the change.
Right. It's changed, but also things are changing. I think that's a positive note. Things are changing, and they have been changing, and people don't always get this perspective. But in 1988, nobody thought that the wall would come down, the whole conflict, east and west end, and then all of a sudden it did. I'm not saying that this is going to happen that easily overnight. That's probably not just going to fall onto us. It's going to be a lot of work. But if we keep up the work, then we can get it done. Definitely. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the people in the room and online. And thank you to our speakers here, and Suzanne and Brook. Thank you for coming all the way over here. Thank you. And have a great Earth Day.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye. So there's a lot of cake and coffee over there. So enjoy.
I'm going to chat more here. master's student, so you're from New York, your farms up there.